Hello, you're watching James. My name's James, you're watching me, and I'm talking about watches. Today I want to talk about affordable vintage watches. And you may ask me, what is an affordable vintage watch? Well, that's pretty easy, isn't it? It's a vintage watch that's affordable. But why do I want to talk about that today? Well, it's because I particularly like vintage watches. However, I don't feel comfortable putting a lot of money into vintage watches. And that's for two real reasons. Firstly, it's not a watch that I'm going to be wearing every single day. I'm not the kind of person to own a vintage watch and wear it day in and day out as my daily wearer. It is an interesting watch in my collection that I wear occasionally, so I don't want to spend too much money on a watch like that. If you do love vintage watches to the point of wanting to wear them daily, that's fine. Maybe it's worth spending some extra money. And secondly, the other reason I don't buy vintage watches too often is that there is that potential to having to spend a lot of money. So you're sort of in that same category again. You end up with a watch that you're not wearing too much, but you're having to sink a lot of money into. And I've learned this sort of the hard way. Well, the good and the bad way, depending on how you look at it. I have two vintage watches in my collection that I've put a lot of money into having completely restored. One watch I'm completely happy that I've done that being my Seiko Pogue that my father gave me. There is an emotional connection for me with that watch. I actually wear that watch relatively regularly, so I was happy to spend some extra money having that fully restored. But I also have a really cool old pocket watch, which I had fully restored. And thinking back now, I wish I had not spent that money on it, because it's not a watch that I use very often. I'd be lucky if I wind it more than half a dozen times per year, and actually using the function of a watch with that pocket watch does not happen very often. So I've spent that money and I don't really use it. Now, I am glad that it is working fine and it works very well, and it is nice to know that, but I didn't really need to invest that money into it. And that made me start to think more about affordable watches and what I actually want out of an affordable vintage watch. And this is what I've come up with. I'm going to flip the camera around and I'm going to show you two watches that I've bought recently. One cost me about 100 Australian dollars, one cost me about 200 Australian dollars. Both are different watches from different eras, but there is the same sort of thought process behind it. Let's flip around and let's check out these watches. So I've currently got a couple of vintage watches in my collection, but these are the two that I wanted to show you today because they're more the affordable sort of vintage watches. And both of them I've had arrive. They sort of work. One works a little bit better than the other, but I'm not planning on spending any money on them. I don't want to actually invest that extra money to make them work perfectly. First one here is a Poljot. Now this is quite an interesting watch because firstly you'll see it's a dual crown. There's no internal rotating bezel here. This is actually a mechanical alarm watch, which is actually very interesting. It's a relatively small watch, but now that I've put it on this Vario watch strap, which is actually to suit my Casio Royale, it actually looks really good and it fits well. And I think being a more of a square size, absolutely wonderful. And check out the dial on this thing. Absolutely incredible. It has almost like a linen look to it. Has a fairly simple case back there. Very, very cool. Now, does it work properly? Well, this one works good enough. If I was going out for a couple of hours wearing this, it pretty much holds time okay. This one's from around about the mid-70s. It's a manually wind only sort of watch. Let's wind it up for you. And you can see it working away. Yep, see, it's actually working quite well. And you can absolutely probably somewhat rely on this for a few hours at the very least. But because this one only cost me about $100, obviously the Vario watch strap is probably worth a little bit of money as well, but I think it fits this watch well. I don't need to spend a lot more money on it. I'm just enjoying it for what it is. I'm enjoying the interesting dial, the interesting layout of the case, and just having something different in my collection. And it looks really cool on wrist. It's just a little bit fun and a little bit different, just something that you're not sort of expecting from a collection. You know, a lot of people have other type of Eastern European watches. The Polyots are a little bit lesser known, but very cool. And there's a lot of the different variations of this brand out there on the used market that you can pick up at a very affordable price. And it might just be a nice, interesting, fun vintage watch that you can have in your collection for an absolutely affordable price. Next is the watch that I am most excited about. It is my Tussauds. Now this is an interesting brand. Well, I think it might be interesting because it's very hard to find any information about this one online. It's obviously an old Swiss-made brand. It does say Swiss-made on the dial there. It is. There's quite a few variations out there. You can buy them on the used market for a relatively affordable price. but the company must have gone under at some point because there's very little information about the company, about the sort of range of watches they came out with. This one's particularly cool because it is a 38mm, and this is a watch from the 1940s, possibly the early 50s, and it's hard to find watches at this sort of size at that sort of time period. But check out the sort of the color of that dial, the vintage sort of look, or the wear and tear, the aging process. You can see there's a real downturned lugs to that. They've obviously been well worn, this particular one. Second sub dial, very, very cool. And I've made my own custom strap for this particular watch because I do like it so much. I wanted to put on something that made it feel a little bit bulkier, but just something that sort of would make it a little bit more special. But does it work? Well, it sort of works. This one here costs more money. This was almost 200 Australian dollars. That one was only about 100 Australian dollars. They said it had been serviced, but it came from overseas. I wasn't completely going to expect it to be working perfectly, and it sort of works. This is not a watch that I'm going to be able to wear and actually sort of be able to trust the time from it. But I'm okay with that because for the cost of actually having this serviced or repaired, it would make it too expensive for me to justify. I just enjoy having this in my collection. I wear it occasionally. I'm not trusting the time on it, but I just enjoy having this sort of vintage style watch, this old watch, something with a little bit of history and a very, very unique, very cool looking sort of look to it. No other watch has that dial because this one has just aged to look like that. I think it is fantastic. I really like it. And I know it's a bit of a weird thing to think of getting a watch and not being able to use it to tell the time. But it's more just about the ownership of it, the enjoyment of it, actually having something very cool and interesting in your collection. It's not going to be a watch I wear every single day. If I was planning on wearing it every single day, if it was going to become my everyday wearing watch, well then I probably would invest that extra money in having it fully fixed. But at this point, both of these watches are just interesting watches to have in my collection, which I just wear occasionally. So as you can see, that Poljot, it sort of works. It keeps time. If I wear it for a few hours, it pretty much keeps time, that's fantastic. But that Swiss-made watch, that doesn't keep time at all. It's not working very well at all. But I like both of these watches. And I could quite easily go out and spend a chunk of money having them either serviced or fully restored and have them working well. But then I'd have a certain amount of money invested in watches that I'm not really going to wear very often. And if I then went to sell them, I probably wouldn't get that money back. So I've come up with another theory or another way of buying vintage watches that makes them more affordable, and it sort of allows you to own some interesting watches without investing too much money. I'm now buying watches in that vintage realm only on occasion, but when I do, I'm looking to spend only a certain amount of money, and I don't care whether the watch works well or not. Now that may sound a bit strange. You may think, hey, why are you buying a watch that doesn't really work? Well, I'm thinking about it from the perspective of that pocket watch, because I don't use that very often. So I don't really need it to work very often. It's more about something that's interesting in my collection, something that I pick up out of my watch box and I look at. And on a very odd occasion when I am actually wearing this watch, I'm going out for dinner, I'm doing something just wanting to wear this watch, I don't care if it's keeping time or not. I have my phone in my pocket anyway, so I know what the time is. It's more about the ownership and enjoyment of that watch. I'm thinking about it from a perspective of not worrying too much about the actual functionality of it. I'm just enjoying it for what it is. So for me, I'm able to afford a really cool vintage watch without investing too much money. In reality, is this working for me? Well, I do keep getting tempted to get these watches restored, but I do keep thinking, how often am I actually going to be wearing these watches? And for me, it doesn't make sense to invest money in these ones. I understand certain vintage watches it's absolutely worth investing in, wearing and enjoying. I just want to try and open people's minds to the fact that not every watch has to work perfectly, especially if you're on a budget, especially when you're looking at vintage watches. Think about how often you're actually going to wear them, what you're actually going to do with them, and why are you wanting to own them. Okay guys, that's it. This is just a thought that's been going around in my head for a while now, and I just wanted to create a video about it. I do appreciate you watching. I would appreciate any comments below telling me what you think about this idea. Do you think I'm completely bonkers? Or do you think it actually might be a good idea to have something interesting in your collection that you don't have to invest too much money in? Alright guys, I hope to see you in the next video.